So, what do you do when you learn something that's uncomfortable that kind of throws everything off, and now you have to walk away from what you thought so that you can embrace this new thing? Hmm? Yeah, let's get into that. It's called the Art of Detachment. Stay tuned. Hey y'all, welcome back to another episode of Unfiltered Truth. If you're new here, thanks for joining. If you're returning, welcome back. Don't forget to like and subscribe and share this message with someone if you find it beneficial or helpful to you at all. Or if you just want to support the channel and help other people reach it in the algorithm, that'd be cool too. Thanks. Okay, so we're going to talk about the art of detachment. Okay. The episode right before this is cognitive dissonance. And so we're just going to go right on into the art of detachment because they kind of go together. So if you haven't watched the previous episode about cognitive dissonance, I would recommend that you go back and check that out. If you're unaware of what that means or what all is involved, I know many of us are fully aware about that and everything like that, but you still may find it interesting. I don't know. Anyway, the art of detachment is going to like spin off of the cognitive dissonance episode because it is the second step, basically. So cognitive dissonance, as we said, is where you have one truth that you know and believe, and then another truth is introduced that conflicts with that first one, and then now you have this internal struggle, okay, or conflict, this inner conflict going on because these two things are true, but they don't necessarily go together, or they're kind of conflicting. However, both of them are true. All right. So this and that are true, not this or that. This and that are true. When you have that type of a situation, it creates cognitive dissonance. Okay. Now, when you come into that place, right, of cognitive dissonance, now you have to figure out what are you going to do with the old belief, the old way that you thought stuff, was. Okay. So how do you deal with that? All right. So that would be the art of detachment. Okay. In the previous episode, I was also talking about like trying to express your findings or your discoveries related to the thing that brought about cognitive dissonance. So when you try to communicate the new stuff that you learned to people who only hold the first truth valid, the people who only believe that the first truth is true, like they're not even open at all to hearing or perceiving any other way or any other truth could potentially exist or be accurate. Okay. When that's the case, we have a choice whether we're going to share the information or not. If we do try to share it, that person has a choice on whether they're going to receive it or not. Okay. And so sometimes when you're trying to share a new truth that you have learned, because maybe you're excited about it, or maybe you're just dealing with the inner conflict of it. And so you're like trying to, process it with another, with another perspective as well, inviting another person to perceive what you're experiencing, or, just add to what you already know, or just run it past them, or maybe even introduce the truth to them as well, right? That person, if they are unwilling to accept that second truth, okay, if they're unwilling to accept the new information at all, and they're just like, no, that can't be, that's absolutely false, absolutely not, and they're like arguing real heavy or whatever, right? Then, you don't have to keep going back and forth and trying to debate your point, trying to be right. You really don't have to decide to drop down into your ego just so you can have the last word, so you can have the strongest argument, so you can be the one who is looked at as the exalted, master teacher or what have you. Okay. You don't have to engage in any of that. All right. You can totally let that person believe whatever they believe, think whatever they think, and just have their own situation going on with God and pray for them from a distance. You could absolutely just pray for them so that, one day they may be led to the truth, or they may be, exposed to the truth, or what have you. Okay. So, the art of detachment is basically releasing people to be people. Releasing things that you thought were true that you find out are not true. Sometimes I'm going to use a different example in this episode just because I don't want it to be too much of what I was talking about in the other one, and I don't want to overdo all of that. So let's say in this situation, this is also another personal example that I can share. This channel also, if you did not know, Unfiltered Truth is my unfiltered truth. I share a lot of personal examples to illustrate the points that I'm making. And, I'm fully transparent, and I am often very vulnerable with the things that I share on here, but I'm doing it for a reason. I'm doing it so that the point can be clear and it can be, and hopefully well received. Okay. So I remember a moment where, you have people, like I had people in my life who I thought were good people. Okay. And I thought had my best interests at heart. All right. And then, they may have done things to hurt me, harm me on purpose. And then, I'm like having this second truth introduced that, oh, they're also this. So while they are this, very nice, very kind, very generous to other people, very, helpful, supportive, blah, 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 they are also this way, very, it could be a lot of different things because I'm thinking about a lot of different situations at once. But basically, to keep it simple, maybe abusive. Okay. Maybe they were very abusive. Maybe they're also very mean-spirited. Maybe they're also very ego-driven. Okay. Maybe they're also very stubborn, very resistant. It could be a million things, right? So they also hold these other qualities. They have some great qualities, but they also have these other qualities. Okay. Now, once I realize that this is the case, I have a decision to make. Like, how am I going to move? Okay. So, it could mean that I end up getting a divorce. It could mean that I end up, leaving the place where I work or go to church or the friends that I have, or, revamping relationships in my life and stuff like that. Because now I recognize that these people have these qualities that are not positive and that bring a lot of chaos and disruption to my life. Okay. So, if that were the case, right, which it was in my situation, then it's like, okay, now I have to figure out what I'm going to do about it. So if I decide to leave these relationships and these people behind or whatever, I can't keep trying to convince them, that the way that they was treating me was not cool or whatever. Like, they did it, so obviously that's how they felt. So obviously that's what they wanted to do. So I'm wasting my breath, clearly, if I try to get them to see things a different way. Like, I just no, I'm not doing that. Okay. So they can think what they want to think. They can feel how they want to feel. They can, whatever. Okay. And if they got something that they feel some type of way about, they can talk to God, because I'm talking to God, so they can talk to God too. Okay. So, there comes a point where you have to just kind of let people do what they're going to do, and, just kind of release them to feel how they want to feel, to think how they want to think, believe what they're going to think. Everybody has their own process, their own journey, their own timing for certain things. I talked about that as well in the episodes about how to heal. Everybody does things and learns things, grows and stuff at different rates and different ways. There's different methods and stuff that God will use for different people, because each of us are unique. All right. So the art of detachment is accepting that. The art of detachment means that you recognize that your journey is your journey. Your process and your timing, it is all yours. It doesn't need to be identical to somebody else's. And matter of fact, it can't be. Even if you wanted it to be, it couldn't be. Twins, identical twins, do not have the same identical personal development and growth journey. You know, the same spiritual enlightenment, or what have you. They don't have the same identical relationship with God, even though they're identical twins. Everybody has their own stuff, their own way, their own time, process, and journey, and all of that. Okay. And so recognizing that, it's a lot easier to let go and let people experience life in the way that they need to experience it. Excuse me for a sec. Okay, so it's much easier to let people have their own experience when you realize that we are all very unique individuals, and God is a sovereign God. He works with each of us in our very own unique way. However he needs to work with us and get his message across to us or through us, it's what he wants to do in his own timing and all of that. Okay. So recognizing that, it's a lot easier to just be like, okay, well, that person is over there with those thoughts and with those beliefs on their own path and in their own way and in their own journey and stuff like that. And that really don't have nothing to do with me. Yeah, they have very strong opinions of me as a person, but even their thoughts and strong opinions are still, even though they're about me, they still belong to them. Those are their thoughts, their beliefs, which I can't control. So even if I do, speed in or steamroll in, bulldoze my way into the situation, and I try to say this, that, and the other, and now I'm debating and I'm going back and forth and everything else or whatever. Even if, for example, you can't convince an abuser that they abused you. They're always going to deny anything that they did, because that's just how those type of people are set up. So they never did anything. It's always you. They were the victim. You were the one that hurt them. How dare you even accuse them of such? Blah, 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 blah. They get extra, extra sensitive. They don't want to hear you say anything at all negative associated with them. Meanwhile, they can come at you all different kinds of ways. They can do all things that are super cruel or mean, and, and do it on purpose. All right. And that's totally fine, because they're justified in their actions. Whereas you, how dare you even, think about, uttering such words to say that they did this and that to you or whatever, right? So you can't convince someone who chose to mistreat you that they did actually mistreat you, because they're never going to take ownership or accountability for that. Okay. Now, once you realize that that's what it is, we all have our choice, right, of how we react to that. And some people will dig their heels in and just, try to drag that person to the truth if that's what it takes. And they will still fight and fight and fight and fight and fight, and try to have the last word and try to be right and everything else. But really, what they probably should do is just detach and release. Okay, just let go and let God. And I know that sounds so cliche, but seriously, like, everything is not for you everything is not for you to solidify. Everything is not for you to convince other people of. Everything is not for you to do. Okay, you're not always in control of certain stuff. So especially when it comes to other people and what they think and believe, you have zero control over that. All right. So sometimes the best thing to do is to honestly just not do anything. Don't say anything. Don't engage with certain people, especially when you see that they already locked into what they think and what they feel, what they believe, and that's it for them. That's it. They are not open to any new information at all. There's no reason to waste your time or waste your energy on that. Just pray and ask God to open up their eyes. pray, ask God to, allow them to have their own personal encounter with his Holy Spirit. So maybe they will know the truth. And pray for the abuser to have their eyes open, maybe have their own personal experience with or personal encounter with the Holy Spirit so that they can be made aware of how they hurt or harmed other people around them or whatever. But basically, praying for that person and letting them sort it out on their own. However they need to do that. You can what they say, you can walk the horse to water, but you can't make them drink. Okay. So sometimes it's necessary to just walk the horse to the water, and whether they drink or not is really not up to you. They either do or they don't. If they're not thirsty, they're not going to drink no water, and you can't do nothing about that. Just, okay, well, you don't want no water? Well, let's just go on. We just keep on walking in. Okay. So, sometimes you just got to let go. Just let go and let that be that. All right. I remember when I was younger, especially like with jobs and stuff like that, if I felt like I was being done wrong in a certain type of job or whatever, I would really fight it. Like, I would fight it. Okay. I wasn't like rude or, insubordinate necessarily or anything like that, but I was a little bit more impulsive. A little bit. I was a lot. I was very impulsive, when I was younger. And, it was those types of situations where it was like, I was really in my ego. I'm talking about in my 20s and stuff. I think all of us are probably in our ego when we're in our 20s. But, and probably all of us are, fairly impulsive because our frontal lobe hasn't fully developed until we're 25 or so. So we probably all were kind of that way to a certain degree. But, I remember being very like, if I felt like something wasn't fair, I would really dig my heels in and harp on it. I would speak on it. I would really try to plead my case. I would really, try to do, everything that I could to make these people see the right way or, different things like that and stuff. And it wasn't until, years of, situations like that where I was working for places and then maybe something would happen and it would feel like it wasn't fair somehow. And, there were some situations where I could talk all I wanted to. It wasn't going to change nothing. For example, if I was pink slipped as a teacher because the district was having cuts, it is what it is. There's nothing that I can do about it. I remember being in a program where I was able to work full time as a teacher and also go to school to be certified. And I was right at the very end of my certification program. I had like maybe 2 or 3 classes left. And then the district that I was working for lost the grant that paid for that program in the first place. So then as a result, because I wasn't in the program, I lost my job. And because I lost my job, I was going to have to substitute teach, which did not pay very well. And I was getting paid by the day. Well, it didn't pay as well as it did if I was on salary as a full teacher. Okay. So it paid okay, but it, and better than a lot of jobs, but it didn't pay as well as I wanted it to pay. Okay. So for me, it was a step down and it was a sacrifice and, all of that. And I didn't want to do that. So I chose not to. I had a choice to continue subbing in that district and get paid day by day and, the days that I work and, no sick days and no vacation time and no paycheck in the summer when school is out and so forth. Or I could get a different job somewhere out of the district and, and avoid all of that. So that's what I ended up doing. I ended up getting a decent job, that paid salary, had some benefits and things like that out of the district or whatever. The downside was I wasn't able to be in that program anymore because, I wasn't working for the district or whatever. So, I had bills to pay though. I had a house, I had a car, I had real grown woman bills. Okay. So, and this was before marriage, before kids and all of that, but the world was still worlding. So I had bills to pay. Okay. So I needed my money to be steady. I couldn't risk, taking a job where I may or may not get paid. I may or may not have work, that sort of stuff with no benefits and everything like that. So for me at the time, the best decision was to get a job outside of the district. Okay. Now that was difficult because I felt like I was stepping away from something that I had been working on building for, quite a while. Well, a few years or whatever at that point. So, I had to learn to let go of that. The thing about it with these jobs and these different situations where I felt like I was being done wrong, and what I learned about it over time was that I'm not a victim ever. Okay. And things happen for me, not to me. So even if the situation is ugly and it's looking reckless and it's looking horrible and stuff like that, it's still an opportunity. Even obstacles and challenges and hardships are still an opportunity. It's an opportunity to learn, to grow, to maybe elevate someone else, to maybe enlighten someone else, to maybe go through the experience, learn what you need to learn, and then reach back and help somebody else. So I'm hoping that this is helping somebody else, because I know people that, I know several people are probably going through these different job hardships and stuff like that, and it seems like things are not fair. Personally, what I had to learn is that until I was willing to accept the truth, I was going to continue to be confronted with it. So every job that I had for a certain period of time kept introducing these different situations where it felt like it was unfair. The job that I went to after leaving the district, that job, I worked there for a while, and I am a person that's very stable. Like, I live in a house for a really long time. I work at a job for a really long time. I have the same friends my whole life. Like, I'm very stable when it comes to stuff. Okay. So when something happens at work that's just like, what, it kind of throws everything off, because I'm not the type of person to just bounce from job to job to job and stuff like that. But there was a period of time in my younger 20s where that was it wasn't a whole bunch of jobs, but it was like, 3, 4, something like that. So I went from the district to working somewhere else, and this place, they downsize every year. And it was an at-will employer. So although it had a salary, although there were perks and benefits and things like that, they were an at-will employer, which means at their will, when they decide to, they can get rid of you if they want to. Okay. And so this particular job where I was working, they downsize every year, and they always let quite a few people go, because that's just what they do. They don't need as many people to work over certain months, so they just let certain people go. They build up a program, and then they're like, okay, we got what we need. You can go on about your way. We can take it from here type stuff, and then they let that person go. So when I was abruptly let go, when I had not even been written up, like nothing ever happened where I did something that I would, I wasn't perfect. I'm not a perfect person, but there was nothing that happened where I was confronted or called out on a thing that then escalated to the point where I was, aware that my job was kind of touch and go. All right. But I was just let go because they were downsizing. All right. And I felt like that was very unfair, and I definitely spoke about it. Okay. To the people in my circle. I vented to the people in my circle about how this thing was unfair and unjust, and I didn't like it. Okay. At the end of the day, I still had to leave that job. I still had to find me something else, right? And I still had to learn to lean on God and develop my faith, so that I would know that he was always taking care of me and stuff like that. So like I said, everything happens for us and not to us. So in that situation where it looked like an extreme hardship, because now, boom, out of nowhere, I'm unemployed. I wasn't even looking for a job because I was content where I was working, and I still have grown woman bills. And here I am again looking for a job. Like, what happened? I went to college. I'm doing everything the right way. I'm not out here being reckless and stuff like that or whatever. But, I had to let that job go, and then I had to be willing and open to receive something else. Okay. So in that little window space, was where, the thing that was happening for me was God was developing my faith. All right. Teaching me that even if I have zero income, He is going to create situations and resolutions and solutions and provision, and I was going to be taken care of. All of my needs would always be met. And they were. Somehow I was still able to make money. I don't even know. Well, yeah, I was working a whole bunch of little side hustles. I had a bunch of side hustles. I was a very hard worker, have always been like that. So I had probably like 3 or 4 side hustles while I was also working the main job. And so I just leaned heavier into the side hustles and did a little bit more while I was also job searching. But, those side hustles paid off because it gave me enough money to be able to pay what I needed to pay as I was going along. I also have people in my life. My parents are awesome and they always have my back and stuff like that, but they weren't like, physically carrying me all that time. I never had to move back home. They weren't, doing everything. I was still doing a lot, working on my own and stuff like that or whatever. But the point that I'm making is that during that little window of being unemployed, God showed me that that was a situation that worked for me, because without that, I would never have developed that faith like that. And so if something should happen that would, throw, everything off its rocker, I lose a job in the future or whatever, maybe I wouldn't be ready to be without income because I had never experienced it before. So it may have terrified me to be without a job because, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? And I'm just crying and I'm, manifesting all these eviction experiences and stuff like that because I don't know how to believe or have faith. You know what I'm saying? So those situations, even though they were difficult, they worked for me by helping me to develop my faith. All right. So, and I noticed that now looking back, I can see at the time I did not see it this way. Okay. At the time when I'm going through the experience, it's very real and it's very unfair. And so, I'm just venting about it. I'm all upset about it. I'm stewing about it. I'm depressed. I'm crying, all the things. Okay. And then, yes, I'm learning about faith or whatever, and I'm learning to rely on God, but then I end up being blessed with another job. Right. And so then I get another job and everything is going fine for a while. And then something happens that's not fair. Okay. My next job, I was sexually harassed by one of my supervisors. And then I told our director, and who happened to be a woman, and, she held my hand like these creepy old men and blah, blah, blah. And it felt like she, had my back and like, we were going to do what we needed to do about this. I felt like I was doing what I was supposed to do. I brought it up to the person that I needed to bring it up to. And, I let her handle it from there. She went to the board. They did, like a little, I wouldn't say investigation, but like a little interrogation sort of situation. And then there were other victims too. I wasn't the only one. There were several other victims and these people spoke up as well. However, for whatever reason, they decided that I needed to remain under this man's supervision, even though I had given them full detail of everything that happened, not just to the director, but also to the board during, this little investigation or whatever. And so even though they knew all of that information, they decided to still keep me under this man's supervision. Okay. I felt that was very unfair. I did not feel safe at work. I did not feel comfortable, talking to him, or I didn't want to have nothing to do with him. I didn't even want to see him. Even to this day, if I run into him out in public, I really, honestly, I don't want to see him. I've forgiven him, yes, but I don't choose to see him. He's not somebody I'm looking forward to seeing. And if I do see him, I speak to him. I smile, I wave, I say hello or whatever. I play nice and polite or whatever, and I keep it moving. Okay. But I don't want to be around him at all, especially not alone. Okay. And the crazy part about it was when he harassed me, it wasn't even like we were one-on-one in a private room or something like that. We were actually in a public place doing a very public event, but the way that he did it was so on the slide, and it was just so over the top. Things he said, things he did, ways he touched me and stuff like that was just not cool at all. And it was in front of, a very large event with a lot of people and stuff. It was just the way that it was done. Nobody would have noticed or seen it because of the way that it was done. And it was a very hard situation to be in. Okay. But, and it was very unfair. It was. Okay. Now I stayed at that job because I had learned my lesson from the very first job where I left impulsively not to do that. The second job, I was kind of forced to leave because they lost the grant and stuff like that. Then the next job, I was forced to leave again because they just decided they wanted to downsize. Now this job, I'm forced to stay under this man's supervision who violated me and stuff like that. And I did everything I could do to try to make that situation be just and fair. Like I tried to ask for I asked for a different supervisor. I asked to work in a different place so that I wouldn't have to even see him or be around him like that at all, or, just different stuff like that, whatever, right? I did everything I could, but this was still the cards that I was being dealt or whatever, right? So what I learned from the very first experience is to not be impulsive. Don't just hurry up and leave because I feel like something isn't fair, which is what I did with my very first job. Okay. But with this job, I decided to stay until I get something else. I ended up getting something else and I ended up being able to leave or whatever. And then as I'm working back in the district that I was in at first, different things are happening that are also unfair. Again, I'm being bounced around. One year I have a job, the next year I don't. Sometimes I don't get called back to work until October. Then I get laid off early, like in April or May or something like that. And then I'm not getting paid because I'm still trying to finish school and get done with certification. It was just a whole thing. And it was years of that. Okay. It wasn't until I realized or recognized that, that these situations work for me and not against me. Okay. So even though it's a hardship, it's an obstacle, it's a humongous challenge, it seems like there's nothing I could do about it. It seems so finite. You know what I'm saying? Even though it's all like that or whatever, there's always something to gain from it. All right. And I noticed that it wasn't until I learned how to spin my perception of something, and really go into it, even if it's a negative situation, a negative obstacle or challenge, go into it with like, an open and willing heart. Like, what can I learn from this situation? What can I learn from this experience? God, show me what to do in this situation. Lead me and direct my steps and show me what I'm supposed to do or whatever, right? And so it wasn't until I took on that position, or it wasn't until I took on that posture, I guess you could say. It wasn't until I was like in that state of mind where I was really open and receptive to be directed and guided, that I was then able to see what I was supposed to be learning and how to take it forward with me. Okay. So once I realized like, okay, people do you wrong, but you still have to love your enemies. You still gotta, leaders sometimes are not right, but you still have to be submitted to their authority. Like, you can't just pop off and, become impulsive and decide you want to quit your job every time something happened. And you can't always dig your heels in and insist on being right or, having the last word in every situation, because sometimes God is trying to teach you something. Okay. It took several situations of, unfairness for me to, or injustice, I guess, for me to learn the lesson that I needed to learn from that experience. Okay. I dealt with abuse from my father for several years, 20 something years. Okay. And once I realized, like, hey, this situation is completely unhealthy, I need to step away from it. That's when I had to detach. I had to detach. I had to release. I had to let him live his life and be where he's going to be, however he's going to be, and do life the way that he wants to do it, because you can never convince an abuser that they abused you. Okay. They won't ever see it that way. They were always the victim. How dare you come at me with this or that, or accusing me, blah, blah, blah. It's a pointless conversation. Okay. So after dealing with that and then being married and, experiencing abuse, but in a different form, and then having that same realization, like, oh, dang, here we are again. It's just, it showed up different. So I didn't even see it at first. It was undetectable because there, it wasn't like the overt way that I know. It wasn't like physically assaulting, or it wasn't, verbally, or, calling me out my name, or, different things like that. It was more mental, emotional, type stuff. So, I was used to people playing games with me, playing on my top, so to speak. I was used to that for all of my life. Okay. So when it came up again and I realized, and I had the aha moment because my mom brought it to my attention, like, hey, this is that. You need to watch out, or whatever, then it was like, there was the shock of the aha moment, which would be the cognitive dissonance. Like, yes, there are some good parts of this person, there's some good parts of this situation, but then there's also this, which is a lot heavier. Even though it's only one or two things, it's so much heavier than this over here. Okay. And so once I had that realization, that aha moment and stuff, then it was like, oh dang, okay, well, I gotta move accordingly. Like, I have a choice. I can either stay in this marriage or I can exit, and because I had already dealt with my biological father and that situation, it honestly was so much easier to deal with the marriage situation. I had already gone through it before. I already had dealt with somebody super close to me that I'm supposed to look up to, that I really trust with my whole life, and then having the realization that they were actually harming me in the worst way, and everything that I thought about them was not really, it was never going to be that. The hope that I was holding on to, it was never going to be that. It was never going to look like how I hoped and prayed that it would eventually become. We were never going to have that father-daughter relationship that I wanted. It was just never going to be that. So as much as I was sticking around and I was trying to hold out and I was trying to pray and all the things, it just was never going to be that, because he was him and he did what he wanted to do. Okay. Same thing in the marriage situation. The difference was, it was so much easier to let go and walk away. It was so much easier to detach and release because I had already gone through it. Okay. I've shared, quite a bit about, my recent situation with, some former friends and stuff like that happened at my church, in the past. And that situation was so much easier to deal with because I had already dealt with my biological father. I had already dealt with my ex-husband. I had already dealt with other family members who had abused me or violated me or done things that were not cool. I had already dealt with, people who had raped me and stuff like that, who were people that I wanted to be with. You know what I'm saying? Wanted to spend time with and wanted to date, different things like that. So already having several of these situations where it's like you trust somebody and then all of a sudden, boom, you get smacked in the face and realize you can't trust them at all. Okay, because they actually trying to do harm to you on purpose. Like, having that realization and then being able to switch gears and move accordingly, it requires you, if you're going to move accordingly, that means you got to let them people go. You got to let them people be where they're going to be so that you can protect your own peace and your own safety, your, and sanity and all of that. Okay, so by the time this happened, 2 or 3 years ago, however long it was, with my friends, it wasn't nothing new to me. I already been here and done this a million times. Okay. dealing with stuff at work that might not necessarily be fair. Like I said, when I started working where I'm working, in this most recent position, it was a completely different demographic. Being the first Black teacher there, I experienced a whole lot of things along with culture shock. It wasn't just the culture shock, it was all the microaggressions and, the hidden racism type things, or racial slurs and derogatory statements and things like that, or whatever, that I was exposed to every single day. Okay, being in a culture that is tolerant of things like that, and only because they're ignorant of them, but then not giving me the space to teach or train about these things, even though that's what I was actually requested to do when I first got hired. It was just a whole, like, that whole thing. So there was a period of time, about a year and a half or so, where I was like basically depressed because, I'm going to work every day and it's like I'm being so disrupted internally with all the racial situations that were going on within the culture and stuff like that. Okay. So, knowing then, what I had learned before about, resistance and not digging in my heels and trying to force my thoughts and opinions onto other people, not trying to force them to see things my way, or, bend to my will and make things right in the way that I feel like they should look, and all of that. I took all of those lessons that I learned for the previous positions into this situation, right? And so I learned how to, shift the environment without being on a platform, without doing it in a major way where it's just so in your face and confrontational. I learned how to address it without being like that. You know what I'm saying? While also being submitted and respectful to the authorities, honoring their opinions and the way that they choose to do things, and just kind of falling in line, staying in my lane. But I learned how to impact that culture and impact that environment in a way that would make it more comfortable for me and all the other people of color that were there as well, without doing a whole big old to do. It took a lot of work. It took a long time. It took about 2 years. It took a lot of effort talking to the right people in the right way, until, that message was received and perceived, and then something was able to be done about it. And even though what was done about it was not necessarily what I wanted done, and I didn't necessarily think it was enough, I couldn't do anything but let that be what it was. I had to detach and I had to release. I had to detach from the expectation of what I thought it should look like, and I had to release the decision makers to make the decisions, and pray, for God to lead them in the way that would be best, and continue to lead me in the way that would be best. If that means staying here, then I stay. If that means, accepting a different position, then, trusting Him to bring that opportunity my way, or whatever, right? So, the detaching and, the releasing I had to do with with the authorities in my employer and stuff like that, or whatever, so that this situation could be dealt with however they felt appropriate, because I learned all of those other lessons in the past about what not to do when you feel like something is unjust or unfair at your job. Okay. And I learned those things the hard way. And what I learned was, as long as I was in that victim space, as long as I was thinking like, this is so unfair, how could they do this to me, blah, 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 it didn't matter what job I went to, I was going to invite or manifest another experience that was very similar. Even though it might be something completely different, whereas one job, they're just downsizing. The next job, I'm actually being sexually harassed in public and doing everything I can to fight that. only to, to be basically penalized in a way because I was just forced to work with that man even closer. Like, that was crazy. But anyways, that happened. Okay. So even though, I did the best that I could do in those situations, I learned what I learned from those situations, and I was able to take that and integrate it moving forward. The previous episode, I also talk about integration, learning something new and deciding how you're going to take that information and kind of marry it with what you already know and figure out how to navigate that situation. Okay. Sometimes you have to let go. Sometimes you have to, embrace. It depends on what's going on. Sometimes you just got to move around. Okay. So anyway, the art of detachment is basically honoring everyone's personal experience and also recognizing that everything is working for us. Okay. It's not happening to us. It's happening for us. And so when we recognize that, it's so much easier to glean the lessons that we need to gain, learn the things that we need to embrace and, be able to struggle, or not really struggle, but be able to like really process and sift through those different things that come together that create cognitive dissonance within us. Being able to confront our resistance, our internal resistance. Like, why am I fighting this so tough? They let me go. I'm not there anymore. Why am I still trying to prove my point? I don't need to prove my point. I'm not there anymore. I don't even want to be there anymore at this point because they don't honor me. They don't respect me. They don't value me. So why would I try to plead my case to somebody who really don't even care? Just let them be where they are, feeling how they feel, thinking what they think. Let them have their own experience. And if it's the Lord's will, He will create a situation, encounter, experience, or whatever it is for them so that He can make His point plain to them. But that's between them and God. That has nothing to do with me at this point. All right. They let me go. I'm not there anymore. Let's let it be what it is. Okay. So, in terms of jobs, that was something that I had to learn. Like, every battle was just not worth fighting. And it's not always important to have the last word. Sometimes it's okay if somebody is wrong and they're convinced that they're right. Just let them think that they're right. It's okay. Even though for a fact that they're wrong, let them go ahead and think what they think, believe what they believe, and whatever. And that's not your business. That's between them and God. And let Him have it. Let Him work it out. Okay. So we have to learn to release and let go. All right. There's so much peace that comes with that because it's not your job to wake somebody up. I talked about what it is to be sleep in the previous episode if you're not aware. So I'm not going to go through all of that now. But if somebody is sleeping, they decide they want to stay asleep. They don't want to learn nothing new. They don't want to, try to gain a new perspective or a new perception on a particular thing. They're not really trying to, research or learn anything at all. It's like they already just, they locked in, decided they the smartest person and they already know everything. They can't be taught anything else, whatever, because they're the master and what have you. Then, let them go ahead and think that. That's their business. Okay? It's not your job to try to make them or convince them to agree with you. All right? So once you take on that kind of disposition, it's like so much easier and so much more peaceful and joyful to go through life because you are not responsible for anybody else's journey. You're not responsible for convincing anyone of anything. Okay, whatever the truth nuggets are that God drops in your spirit, however God decides that He wants to use you, if you're leaning into that and you're allowing Him to do what He wants to do through you, that's what matters. Okay, you don't have to make somebody agree with the vision that God has for your life or the purpose or the calling that God has on your life. So, anyhow, I just wanted to drop this to because I said I would. I said the art of detachment would be its own episode. So here it is, okay? And I hope that you gain something from this. Let people live, whether you agree with them or whether you don't. There's nothing wrong with sharing your viewpoint or whatever, but when we get into digging our heels in and trying to convince people to see things the way that we see them, then, that's where we run into difficulty, because we just create a lot of stress for ourselves unnecessarily, trying to do too much, trying to step in God's lane and do what he does when he's the only one that has sovereignty, that can control everything that's going on. Okay. So sometimes we just got to let people do what they do, feel how they feel, detach and let go. Even if we know that they're making a bad choice, even if we know that they're incorrect about something, let it do what it do. Let them do what they want to do, and just let go and let God. That's the whole point of the art of detachment. It definitely brings you peace, and it brings you so much clarity. And above all of that, it brings you so much joy. Oh my goodness. Yes. Okay. So, anyways, I hope you got something from this. If you did, please like, share, subscribe, all of those things. And I will see you next time. Thank you.